Just a heads up, this video will be covering heavy sensitive topics like the last Cry of Fear video, so if that's a problem for you, I advise you leave. Also, I am semi-drunk recording this one. It's currently Thanksgiving 2024, so if I sound off, that's why. Anyway, now for the intro. Picture this. Imagine your worst fears, your anxieties, all of your traumas and mistakes, all given physical form and a taste for blood. As you sprint through the empty streets trying to find a place to hide, they creep in the dark waiting for the perfect opportunity to pounce. And at any given point one could try to. That, my dear viewer, describes the subjects of today's video, the various monsters of Cry of Fear. Each one being a construct of Simon's mind, born from his trauma, the aforementioned Simon being the game's protagonist. For further elaboration on who he is, see my previous Cry of Fear video, as this video in particular is focused on the monsters and the bosses, what each one represents and some general information on them. Albeit I'll be doing this in a way where monsters with similar or the same symbolic meaning will be grouped together as to not waste time. And with that, getting straight into it, starting with the first monster, the crawlers. Crawlers typically look like the one on the left, but the one on the right only appears once. Crawlers themselves are a rare encounter that only happens around ventilation systems and tight areas. They move fast, just as fast as the croucher, and can catch up to you incredibly quickly, albeit they have to stop to attack and their attacks are fairly slow, so evading them is rather easy. The second variation of the crawler, which has the crawler's body and the head of a citalopram if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that specific variant appears at the end of a long vent system in the subway. It is functionally the same as the common version, albeit this is the only place where you can find it. This creature being named the crippled, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. This singular variation spawning an event that leads to the Remington 870 shotgun. The common crawler and its rare version the crippled both represent the same thing, Simon's crippled state, as both variants drag themselves with their arms, but the crippled in particular has especially broken legs, as both represent Simon being injured in the hit and run incident, just like the next three monsters we're going to discuss. Moving on to the next monster, we have the Croucher, which is a variation of the slower and faceless enemies that walks on four limbs, easily able to duck under most of your melee attacks and attack your legs. This variant of both enemies only showing up after fighting the Sora boss in the basement of the apartments, albeit once you finish this section and leave they don't spawn for the rest of the game. And regarding actually dealing with them, it's quite possible to just jump over them without taking any damage. They also can't attack you while you're on top of them, which makes them extremely vulnerable. And if you're extremely bored, you could actually try and ride one using this tactic. Regarding their relevance to Simon, however, they less represent his injury and more his shift in perspective, him being lower to the ground. And with that, now onto the next monster, that being the Slower, the most common and early enemies you come across throughout the game. They come in three different aesthetic colour variants: red sweater, navy jumper, and green striped shirts, albeit there are less common, more unique variants. Regarding them, despite being named slowers, they're not particularly slow, varying between erratic limping shuffles and maddening flailing dashes, with their heads locked onto you with every jagged jolt and convulsion, sometimes smashing into objects in the environment only to shuffle wildly, albeit when they're close distance with the player they'll swing their hammer in a distinct pattern, being usually from right to left or upwards several times. And despite them not being the strongest foes you can go against, they are the most often you'll find, especially in the early game when you're armed with just a knife, which makes them particularly threatening in the harder difficulties. Their violent body movements also make landing headshots difficult, so it's advised you either have really good skill at getting headshots on these things or you go for body shots or melee, all while keeping yourself away from corners to not get trapped. Albeit fighting them with the knife is the only thing you can really do early game. When they take initial damage they'll get stunned, allowing you to get some actual hits in on them. You can get 3 to 4 safe knife stabs on them while the creature is recoiling, which is something you should learn if you're playing the game on Nightmare or Hard mode. They also have a behaviour where they'll enter an attack stance. If you approach them in this stance, they can very quickly follow up with additional attacks, and they can get some hits on you even if you dodge backwards. The animation they do, which is a warning sign of this, is them basically ducking down, or holding out their hammer ready to attack. And when they do so, avoid knifing them in the few seconds after you've provoked them to attack, or you will likely take a hit or two. Now let's just quickly skim through the variants of these guys. Type 1 is the regular ones you find throughout most of the earlier parts of the game. Slow attack speed, slow movement speed, they also appear in the later parts as a jump scare. The second variant is that special variant of Crawler we mentioned. Type 3 is one that wears a grey boiler suit and a mask and resembles Michael Myers, appearing mainly in the middle and latter sections of the game, noticeably more durable than the previous two, and they move and attack faster. Next variant is referred to as Slower No, a special 3-headed version that appears once in the entire main campaign, just like the upper enemies who we'll be talking about later. It is found exclusively inside the TL Trading AB building, and spawns after the player picks up a Glock 19 magazine that comes with an exceedingly loud screaming voice, although they're not very tough to defeat, albeit it appears more in the co-op campaign. Next version is Slower 10-1. They are slowers, albeit they've been entangled in red tentacles similar to the appendages of the human flower. These most likely existing to apply some sort of misdirection to those who didn't pay attention to the plot towards the beginning of the game, as they look like something that would be the result of some sort of biological outbreak. And lastly, we have Slower 10-2. These variants cannot move as they're pinned to the wall by the red tendrils, albeit they can still hit you if you get too close to them. When it comes to a little bit of tactical information, it's pretty easy to kill Slower 3 and Slower 10-2. Easy way to deal with Slower 3 is just pistol whip it and shoot it in the face, while 10-2 can only attack things in front of it, so just attack it from the side. With that, now to cover their relevance to Simon. They essentially symbolize how Simon struggles with his own physical limitations, due to the non-functioning of his legs, ultimately representing his helplessness and frustration. Their sluggish, impaired movements, reflecting Simon's lack of mobility, as he tries to navigate the world with these problems. And with that, now to cover the last monster of this section, that being the Upper. These creatures are just a rare version of the Slower that can be killed the same way. When encountered, they kick at you with their broken limbs in different directions, and upon spawning, they unleash a violent scream that lasts for several seconds, a particularly loud, very noticeably pained wail that you are not going to be ignoring anytime soon. This particular enemy only appearing once in the single player campaign, but can appear up to several times in the co-op campaign. Regarding its relevance to Simon, this one's fairly obvious, but in case you don't get it, it represents the moment Simon got hit by the car, and the loud wail is him screaming in agony as his legs are folded like a fucking omelette. And it running using its arms represents not just his legs not working, but him having to use his arms to move the wheelchair around. And with that, that's the Upper covered, along with all the monsters that represent Simon being crippled in a more direct manner. Now to move on to the ones that represent him being in a wheelchair bound state. First up in this category we have the Faster, which comes in two variants, male and female. These creatures are first encountered in the apartments, the female being the one you encounter first. It lets out piercing screams and attacks by slashing and stabbing with its iron arms, its lower legs consisting of the same metal spikes as its arms, these metallic limbs giving it a distinct walking sound. When killed, in its death animation it stabs itself in the neck, falls to the ground and lets out a sad painful wail, the one we discussed being the first variant. The second variant only appears in Doctor mode and Cooperative mode, being found in the apartments in place of the first variant. It also appears in the co-op campaign, in an optional house in the forest, and in the aforementioned Doctor mode. The second variant has a cage growing out of its shoulders forming around its head, which makes it impossible to kill the creature with a headshot, and it's also worth noting that the male version has a distinct lack of blood coating its limbs, only having spots of what appear to be rust. In regards to their relevancy to Simon, both variants, having metallic appendages, replacing their limbs, could represent how Simon's legs got replaced by a metallic wheelchair after the hit and run, and the cage on the male version could represent how Simon feels trapped. The creature stabbing itself when killed could represent Simon wanting to kill himself, which makes sense given that 3 out of 4 endings involve Simon dying. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, we have the Human Flower, a mass of writhing flesh with multiple tendrils and limbs and faces emerging from it, alongside a giant arm it uses to strike at the player. It's not exactly an enemy and more an obstruction or an environmental hazard. It can't be killed by direct damage from the player, so all you can really do is either bypass it or find an alternate means of killing it. Regarding how it works, this thing will instantly kill you if you get within range. So if you're getting attacked by a group of enemies, make sure you're not accidentally getting pushed towards this thing. This thing appears twice in the main game, on Ronald Street and in the subway. The one on Ronald Street you have to avoid, but the one in the subway is killed by ramming a train into it, allowing you to safely pass by. Albeit this one will instead hit you and damage you similar to the Watchros if you get near it, and it appears in Doctor mode and needs to be avoided just like in the main game. Also, developer commentary claims that the creature was created to trick the player into thinking that a biological outbreak was responsible for the monster's existence. The Human Flower was supposed to at one point be shown expanding across the city and assimilating any slowers it came into contact with some versions of the Slower having tendrils growing throughout their body similar to ones we mentioned earlier. Albeit we only see 2 of them, so this idea was clearly not followed through. Albeit regarding its relevance to Simon, the creature's hideous form most likely represents how Simon views the current state of his body, and the creature being rooted in place most likely represents how Simon feels stuck in his current situation. And with that, those are the monsters that represent Simon being stuck in a wheelchair bound state. Now to cover the ones that have relations to the world around Simon and its events, which is going to be incredibly quick because there's just 2 of these guys. The first of these is the baby, these little shitters being the weakest enemy in the whole game, after you pick up the key to the neighbour's door. Albeit they only spawn, functionally they have no real purpose other than to ambush the player. They charge at you upon seeing you, and when they reach you their heads explode and a spike launches out of them, which kills the creature in the process. Albeit this spike does deal a decent bit of damage. Regarding their relevancy to Simon, considering they only spawn after you get the key to the neighbour across his apartment, it could be that they represent the younglings of his neighbours. Also, I have to use the word youngling because YouTube doesn't like the C or the K word. But anyway, it's possible he found them annoying and that's why they're just stupid little ambush enemies. But the creatures attack via suicide, which could be a parallel to how Simon has felt alone his entire life, and has possibly contemplated ending his own life for a while, which is exactly what happens in 3 out of the 4 endings. But yeah, anyway, moving on to the next enemy. We have the C word I can't say, so we're going to call them younglings. These not as little shitters, they're only encountered in the apartments, and are very similar to the slowers in terms of combat, in that they move fast and rely on melee, albeit they attack by rushing your legs and slashing at you in 2-hit combos. They're also significantly smaller, which makes them harder to hit, and their rate of attack is considerably quick, which makes them exceedingly dangerous if not outright deadly if you get cornered by one. But when it comes to countering them, if you have a good supply of ammo handy, it is very much recommended you just pop a few caps in the wee bastards, albeit if you're forced into using melee, try to keep them in the most open area readily available to you. Move in for a quick hit or 2 then dodge back before they can counter. And we're at now to cover their relevance to Simon. While there's not too much relevance between these creatures and Simon himself, it's more directed to the PDF serial killer that used to live in the same building as him. I really want to call it what it is, but unfortunately I can't because this fucking website sucks. But essentially these creatures represent his victims, which is why they wear garbage bags and duct tape. That very likely being the things their bodies were dumped in, the knives they hold very likely being the ones that took their lives. Or alternatively, more simply, they could represent the wee shitters living somewhere else in the apartment, their existence probably being an annoyance to Simon. But they may also relate to Simon via their height, as due to how short these creatures are, the only place they'd really be able to attack him is his legs, which sorta corresponds to Simon's injuries, albeit the connections to Simon are pretty weak. So I would personally say they represent the victims of the PDF serial killer, who probably lived in the same apartment building and killed his victims prior to Simon writing the book while still being under therapy from Dr. Purnell, so essentially before the main event of the game. And with that, those 2 are covered. Now to move on to monsters that represent Simon's relations to other people. Luckily there's only 2 of them in this category, and the first of those is the Faceless, which often swarm you in large numbers, albeit they go down much easier than the slowers, so if you got a good amount of ammunition for your gun, they're hardly a threat. Like seriously, if you have enough ammo, you can just decimate these wee shitters. But outside of that, you only really encounter them in 3 places. The college, the apartments when you go back to them, and the roped off one. And their main advantage against you is early on in the college, that being that they have much greater numbers, and there's darkness limiting your options for fighting them. The best way to deal with them is usually dual wielding the phone and either the VP-70 or the Glock, and popping a few caps in them with body shots. 4 Glock shots to the body, or 2 bursts from the VP-70, on hard mode should do it, albeit do keep in mind you can't reload with one hand, so try to make space for a safe spot when low on bullets. It's also recommended you drop your unneeded weapons before you go in, as you're going to need to pick up some key items as you traverse through the darkened college, which mitigates the amount of backtracking and run-ins with them. Anyway, there's also variants of these things, so we're going to quickly go over those. Firstly, a special variant appears in the final boss fight for ending 1, 2 and 3, in which the player is confronted by Wheelchair Simon. Platforms lowering down into the arena, introducing increasing quantities of the Twister Head variant, these creatures having metallic hooks for heads, except a particular single one called Twister V, which is what's named in the model files. This one featuring a valve for a head, which drops when the creature is killed, and is used to open the gate as to reach 6 Simon. There is another variant found as you return to the apartments. It lies on the floor almost lifelessly to trick you into thinking it's dead, but it will scuttle over to you and attack if you get close, able to move and attack exceedingly quick, having the fastest attack speed of any enemy in the game, which makes melee against them useless, this particular variant being the Faceless Croucher mentioned in the beginning section of the video, albeit weirdly enough this specific version of the Faceless is grouped in with the Croucher enemies, rather than the enemy type it actually resembles. But anyway, it's advised you only use firearms when going against these creatures, particularly the shotgun, which can kill them in 1 or 2 shots, albeit as you progress the shotgun gets gradually phased out by the TMP, the VP-70 and the hunting rifle. And lastly there is the, and I quote, ghostly end quote faceless, which rushes you after falling through the walkway inside the hallucinatory sequence inside the bloody apartment room's basement. After encountering the facehead in question a second time, they are very ironically faced facelesses, which appear to have no body, inside the darkened hall you encountered them in. They're functionally the same as the other faceless though and can be easily outrun, existing pretty much for scares after a false encounter with the Saw Runner. Regarding their relevance to Simon, considering the fact the model is supposed to be of a female, they could possibly represent that Simon feels as if he's hurt Sophie, especially with how desperately he reacted to her rejecting his feelings, as he can, and I quote, see it in her eyes. He can see the damage he and his desperation have done to her, especially with his now crippled state. He pretty much feels ashamed to look her in the face, albeit the violent bloody model it has could represent how he kills her in ending 1 and 2 to keep her to himself. But they may also represent the anxiety in a relationship between Simon and Dr. Purnell and how he doesn't trust him, especially with the doctor trying to do his job and figure out what's wrong with Simon by trying to actually talk to him through asking questions about his personality and his life and such, albeit Simon refuses to elaborate on these, which is an idea that gets reinforced by the fact they appear shortly after the corridor in which the doctor talks about Simon's refusal to talk about his personal life. And they could also represent the other students of the college that Simon attended, or more accurately his anxiety with interacting with other people. I would add now to move on to the next character, and that's Dr. Purnell. But to be more specific, this is how Simon sees Dr. Purnell. In reality, outside of Simon's book, he is a psychiatrist, and is the doctor seen in some of the flashbacks that Simon has during the game, albeit the malicious and sadistic version we see mirrors what Simon views him as. To be more specific, as a strange, untrustworthy man. But actually, you know what, I think it's best I save Dr. Purnell for his own mini video. Because 1, I don't want to make this video too long, and 2, because I feel like he deserves it. But yeah, with that, those are the relations to others done. Now we have 2 sections left to cover, the ones that have no known meaning or I'm just not sure what they could be, and the ones representing Simon's mental state, which is the largest group of them all. So depending on how long this video is, I might split it into 2. Actually, you know what? The ones with no known meaning or I'm unsure on what they actually mean, I'm gonna cover those now, and depending on how long the resulting video is, I might split this into 2 parts. But anyway, yeah, getting straight into it. First we have the Dreamer. This thing only appears as a jump scare in single player, albeit it can appear as an enemy in multiplayer, acting just like the Crazy Runner. When it appears in single player, as an apparition and screamer, it appears at the very beginning of the You Will Die sequence, which happens right after killing Mace and retrieving the key from its stomach, and then after first escaping the Saw Runner, when Simon enters a building with plenty of rooms, specifically when entering one room in particular and heading back. The Dreamer will burst from the room's door while making a high-pitched scream. This creature only appears as an enemy in the co-op campaign Manhunt, while entering the forest section of the campaign, in which you'll find many of them. And also, by the way, these things are often misidentified as a woman, but if you actually look at its texture, it has a man's face and a beard. So in reality, this is a scraggly old man living out in the woods with extremely long hair, at least as far as the co-op campaign is concerned, and it was inspired by a nightmare Rumpel had while working on a map, in which a woman in red appeared and screamed in his face as he answered the door, and despite him not appreciating jump scares, he put it in anyway, but in summary it's just a reskinned Crazy Runner. Symbolism wise, not sure what they represent, so that's why they're in this category. Moving on to the aforementioned Crazy Runner, it's a monster first encountered in the forest segment of the game, which becomes the most common enemy faced after, are completely silent until they spot the player, at which point they'll rapidly breathe in a panicked manner as they pursue you with a knife ready. Their melee attacks are quicker and faster than your branch, so you have to be careful with your timing and positioning to get out of a fight with one unscathed. And, I'm gonna be honest, these things are absolute fucking shitters, as they usually appear in very large groups and tend to ambush Simon, so you gotta be very careful in fighting more than one of them. In fact, I honestly don't like these enemies. Like, I remember playing the Manhunt game mode with that one specific friend I mentioned in the last video, and there's a very specific set of stairs in one of the buildings that if you go up it, it collapses and you fall through it. I fell through it and landed in a dark room, turned on my flashlight and got stabbed to death by 10 of these things. And when I finally respawned and went back to where they were to deal with them, the shitters ate up all my ammo. Primarily because one of my friends was a dumbass and opened up a door leading to the underside of the stairs, letting them all out, and we got rushed by all 10 of them at once. I think it was 10, may have been a bit more than that, maybe 12. But regardless, these shitters suck. Probably because I think he set it to difficult or nightmare when we were playing, but I can't quite remember, so whatever, moving on. Next we have the Spitter. I'm not entirely sure on the symbolism of these guys. I personally think that Simon, because he believes that people are saying terrible things about him, It could be that these things are literally spitting shit at him, so they're a literal manifestation of what he thinks people are saying about him. Or they could be related to his crippled state, as these things can't move on their own and they're blindfolded, so it could symbolize how he's vulnerable and how he feels lost and stuff. Albeit I can't really pin it down with these guys. But anyway, these monsters are only encountered in the train segment, both in single player and co-op, specifically in single player while Simon searches for the lost feet. They sit suspended from the train roof, and they hang down through the windows, spitting at the player. Once killed, they lose their grip and fall down onto the tracks below, and the closed-in nature of the train makes it difficult to avoid their attacks. And with that, now to move on to the next one, the face, which only appears twice in the game. In the prologue, after reaching the X in the distance, it jump scares the player, also awakening Simon from a nightmare, and in a room lined with cages of faceless, the face is trapped by its neck through a hole in the floor in which it doesn't even acknowledge you, it just kind of swings around biting and staring at nothing. Like it's just swinging around biting it just in random directions. Although it will bite you if you approach it, so it's more an environmental hazard than anything. And it has no known relevance to Simon, outside of potentially being symbolic of how he feels trapped and helpless, along with his self-loathing and distress at his current situation. Overall, the face is pretty harmless, it doesn't even do much damage when it bites you. It's just really kinda there, all things considered. And lastly, for this section of the video, we have the Watro, which is encountered exclusively in the co-op campaign, and are only encountered and fought at the docks. They remain dormant underwater until the player gets within range, at which point they will emerge and wait for the player to get within attack range, and if they do manage to hit you, they'll do considerable amounts of damage. The creature also has a great resemblance to the human flower, which is in reality supposed to be a larger, fully matured version of the Watro, albeit unlike its larger counterpart, you can actually kill them, the Watro having 160 health. Albeit a tip to not wasting all your ammo on the Watro is to simply jump over its arm when he's about to hit you, which, if you manage to pull off, saves you the much needed ammo, but ultimately that's pretty much it for them. And with that, that's the no known meaning or unsure enemy category finished. Alright, now to check how long this video is, and it's about 21.5 minutes at this point in the recording. You know what, yeah, that's long enough, I'll separate this into 2 videos. Well, dear viewer, I hope you enjoyed this part 1 of this analysis. I'll see you in part 2. Goodbye.